2 weeks ago, I started this show saying that once again, the center held in Europe. And that was in part because of Poland, where the centrist Warsaw Mayor Rafal Trzaskowski narrowly beat the nationalist Karol Nawrocki in the first round of the presidential elections. That is no longer the case. In last Sunday's runoff, Trzaskowski failed to materialize a victory and lost against Nawrocki, the candidate backed by the right-wing Law and Justice Party. My guests today attribute Trzaskowski's failure to the fact that Prime Minister Tusk hasn't been able to pass the significant reforms he promised before being elected almost 2 years ago. Even though the main reason why he hasn't been able to do so is because of President Duda from the Law and Justice Party. And yet, polls elected a president that is only going to make Tusk's life even harder, if not impossible. From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Katarina Villanova. Today on the show, the center fails in Poland and the right-wing party wins once again. I'm joined by Leszek Gwiazdowski, editor-in-chief of Liberty, a journal he founded to promote freedom and counter-populism, and Michał Olszewski, former deputy mayor of Warsaw, who served under Rafał Trzaskowski for 6 years. First, here's my conversation with Leszek Gwiazdowski. Less than 2 years ago, Poland elected Donald Tusk as prime minister, ending 8 years of law and justice rule. How can we understand this Sunday's results and the shift now to a populist and nationalist leader that, not even all these dubious revelations seem to make a dent?
Right. Thank you. It's a very good question. I think a lot of Poles are struggling right now to understand what really happened and why it happens. So, in essence, the president in Poland is usually necessary for any legislation to pass. So the government can rule, but if it wants to make any legislation, he or she, a prime minister, needs a president to sign off. If they want to reject the veto of the president, you need 3/5 of the parliaments to reject the veto of the president, and then legislation passes. In Polish case, the government doesn't have such a majority. So the last 2 years, in many aspects, were a sort of in between the elections that actually gave the power to Donald Tusk and coalition government, four-party coalition, very difficult coalition. And on the other hand, a lot of reforms, at least the promise during the campaign in 2023, were sort of pushed down the line, waiting for the president, a new president, hopefully from their perspective, Rafał Trzaskowski, the mayor of Warsaw, who actually lost narrowly, but lost the elections to sign off. It didn't happen, and many people blame the government for not even trying in the first 2 years to prove to the population that they have an idea what sort of legislation to introduce to speed up the reform, and even to prove to the Poles that they actually need a president. Because one of the problems was that the current president, also from Law and Justice, didn't get that much things to veto. So I think it's a complex issue, but it's hard to imagine any significant reforms from now on to be accepted by Parliament and new President Karol Nawrocki.
Exactly. It's almost as if the government was waiting for this past almost 2 years, wishfully thinking that a new president would come along. But what I'm trying to understand here is that, so we all know that the president is largely a ceremonial role, but it does have the key role that he can veto legislation, which could then only be overruled if with a 60% majority in parliament, which Tusk's coalition does not have. What I'm trying to understand here, and Tusk already said that nothing really changes now because the president is Andrzej Duda, who's already from the Law and Justice Party. So how different will it actually be now that Nawrocki was elected president? Will it be much more difficult for Tusk to pass legislation specifically on the rule of law reforms that he so ardently wants to pass?
Well, obviously, nothing that would try to unwind the things that previous governments, Law and Justice, done, it won't happen. We have to just be conscious that it's impossible. The only way would be trying to go around doing it without legislation, similarly to what things Biden tried to achieve in the US, or Donald Trump is trying to achieve now, especially Donald Trump. But as we know, it's not always legal and it's not always possible. especially with issues like judiciary system. I think it's almost impossible. On the other hand, you're right. Nothing really changes because we had the law and justice president for the last 10 years, and 2 years there was a cohabitation with the current government. But politics is not just passing legislation. Politics is also emotions and hope. And the fact that for almost 2 years, people waited for those elections as decisive points where a sort of new era of rule can begin were important. And they have nothing to wait for now. It's going to be like it is. So I think for governments, the problem that because they really wasted last 2 years, they cannot waste any more time. They could have done more, but there was a sort of point in which there's going to be a new beginning. Now, I think for many people, it's becoming obvious, or is quite probable because nothing's obvious in politics, is that in 2 years is going to be a push to the right. It's going to be a return to power by law and justice with even far right Confederacja, another far right party. And there is nothing at the moment that seems to be able to stop that on the side of the coalition. So, I think there'll be certain ambiguity whether everyone would try that hard, knowing they have to hedge against the losing elections. So I think a lot of people, including key people in administration, they might be just thinking, okay, why we would try to go around law and the rules to introduce the reforms of this government if in 2 years' time they might be gone and we will face real problems with the new government. So I think there's a question now whether they will be just waiting and doing nothing because they will have no power, or they will try to push forward, knowing that if they don't achieve anything in those 2 years, they might be wiped out electorally.
There was an expression used by Karolina Wigura. She's an associate professor at the University of Warsaw, and she called this period since Tusk's election as the Polish liberal interlude. So we can understand Tusk's victory coming after 8 years of law and justice rule. And now we have Poles electing yet again president from a right-wing party. Could we then understand Tusk's victory at the end of 2023 as an exception to Polish politics somehow?
No, I think I disagree. And I think it would be naive to interpret those elections as the votes for return to what law and justice done in the previous 8 years. We have to be conscious that 40% of electorates in the first round of elections, because in Poland we have 2 rounds of elections. In the first round, around 30% people voted for Nawrocki, a new president-elect. Around 30% voted for Trzaskowski, a mayor of Warsaw who lost. And 40%, almost 40% of people chose another candidate. Only in the second round, those people chose between one or the other candidate. But the majority of people who voted chose neither of the two. Some of them voted for even more to the far right. Some of them chose left, even like left against who is not in the coalition with Donald Tusk. But I think especially young people who voted, especially young men, because we had a record turnout of the young population. I think they very much rejected the political system as it is because they are tired of 20 years of civic platform and law and justice just switching in power. So I think for them, they are both evils and they don't want to choose between two evils. And some of them abstained, some of them chose in the end Nawrocki, but it doesn't mean that those people necessarily want law and justice back to power. So it's a bit complex. It doesn't mean, of course, they won't come back because you just need about 30 something percent perhaps to rule the country and you can build a coalition around it. But we are in an interesting period that I think the old is not yet dead, but the new hasn't been born. And we are in this sort of interlude, but not interlude of liberal interlude, because Donald Tusk rule is far from liberal anyway. But we're in this interlude where we don't know yet what's next to come. And I think we're going to have a generational shift in Polish politics. If not in 2027, then afterwards. But I think people are waiting for new ideas, and especially on the left wing or liberal side or center right, anything that is not far right. Now people will be really looking hard for narratives that might be able to bring those new voters, these young people, to the democratic side against the far right. So I think the battle is not yet lost by the people who oppose the right wing rule in Poland.
Opinion polls have shown that the Polish citizens are growing frustrated, and you already said it, that citizens are frustrated at Tusk's inability to pass legislation, this policy of almost wait it out until these elections. But what I then don't understand is then why would they give a victory to a politician that would just make Tusk's life even harder, if not impossible? How do we square this circle?
Those who are frustrated with the government of not doing enough are not the people who voted for Nawrocki, because those people obviously wanted the government not to be able to succeed. So the problem is that in politics, you try to mobilize your side, and this government, Trzaskowski, mobilized a lot of voters who voted not 2023, but slightly less than he needed. It was just 300,000 votes of difference between Nawrocki and Trzaskowski. So some of those people were frustrated because they didn't see the government trying. They didn't see this government as efficient. They didn't believe that Trzaskowski is representing them because he is from Warsaw. He is, the sort of elite person. And I think in any circumstances for such candidate, it will be very hard to win in a country which is so rural in many aspects, with so many small towns, people who have very different lives than their life in the capital. So it was a bet that was almost won, but I think it was almost also impossible to pull off in the circumstances where you have so many people who are against the establishment and who rejected the previous government. But the fact that they rejected previous government doesn't mean they are necessarily very pro this government, right? So it's easier to be against than pro something. And the problem was that, in my opinion, in those elections, especially the civic platform, the Rafał Trzaskowski candidates, didn't really offer a vision of what this presidency is going to be, why he needs to win, why Poland needs a president like him, who is a progressive, he is pro-LGBT, he's very open, and they didn't sort of explain how it connects those issues that he stands for as a mayor of Warsaw, which is relatively easy to be pro-LGBT in Warsaw, why it is important, this equality, how does it translate for people who live in a town somewhere in the southeastern Poland of 2,000 people, why it is important they elect someone like this. And they preferred to speak about the other candidates, Nawrocki, who, as you mentioned, had a lot of skeletons in his closet. Some of them fell out. We still see what's going to happen what he's going to get to know about him in the future. But somehow Trzaskowski didn't talk about not himself, but Poland and his vision of Poland. And I think it was a failure that could have been amended. Now it's too late. So yeah, I think a lot of Poles didn't want that to succeed, and actually, I think they would like to see him retired together with his nemesis Jarosław Kaczyński of Law and Justice.
Looking at Poland's electoral map, it's very clear to see this divide between the rural areas and the big cities. I guess this is nothing new and quite recurrent in Polish elections, but how much did it play this rural versus urban divide? How much did it influence the results, considering, like, as you said, that Trzaskowski was not able to translate his message to people living in smaller cities or just the rural parts of Poland?
Right. So about 80% of people who live in the big cities voted for Trzaskowski, and about 70% of people who live in the rural areas voted for Nawrocki. But the problem is that much more people live in the rural areas, about 1/3 of the population. And in big cities, it's maybe like 1/5. So you see from these numbers that this is important, at least not to lose too high and for the liberal candidates at the rural areas. And so you can say that in many ways, those elections were won by the angry young men, because also the young generation voted for Nawrocki. We don't know exactly how many young men voted. We don't know this from exit poll, but we can assume that it could be like 2-1 voting for Nawrocki, especially rural areas where primarily falling for Nawrocki, and also people without higher degree. Most of them voted for Nawrocki. So it's sort of like this division between those who succeeded or consider themselves to be successful, and this country is helping them success, and those who I think are could be frustrated with chances they got, and they perhaps want a change, or at least someone who would defend them from change that's unwanted, like migration, for example, or those liberal, progressive, leftist trends from European Union in their eyes, something that will spoil their, Catholic culture and so on. Yeah, this division is quite clear, but I think it's fueled by the politicians because it's really what allows them to rule is to try to make these elections quite apocalyptic, almost like it is the end of the world if the other side wins. And I think a lot of people interested in politics really felt like this. That's why the progressive sides today has this sort of huge hangover, and I think it's almost like they lost someone, or someone close, because it felt so important. And I think this division, even though it's real, there's, of course, some people are more open to the changes, and some of them are more conservative. It's still a very homogeneous country in many ways. A lot of people have the background in the countryside, even if they live in a big city. We have very little minorities, at least among the citizens, because we have now more and more migrants in the country. So it's almost like a fake division, in many ways. And I think a lot of people would be waiting for unifying message, especially with so many threats from Russia and elsewhere. But I don't think that's anyone is ready to offer this and succeed.
Coming up is my conversation with Michał Olszewski, former deputy mayor of Warsaw, who served under Rafal Trzaskowski for 6 years. Let's start by trying to understand the results. In the end, it was a very, very, very tight race with a difference of roughly 1%. I want to understand what ultimately gave the victory to Nawrocki, or if the better question here is, why did Trzaskowski lose the race?
Of course, I really regret that Trzaskowski didn't win, but it's another part of the story, because Law and Justice from the beginning of the campaign, they knew it, who gonna vote for them, and that's why they simplified the message that they sent to voters, and they used, in my opinion, very dangerous kind of the message. But they are not only one in Europe that they use it, because they use the language of let's say strong right parties from France, from Germany, Hungary, Slovakia. That's the same kind of language which say migration is bad. If you lose your money, that's because of the migration problem, migration crisis in European Union. Generally speaking, European Union is bad, or it's like evil, because they taking the power to Brussels, and we lose our independency. We are not safe because of the Ukrainian crisis, but we shouldn't intervene in the Ukrainian crisis, because it's not our war; that's the war of Ukraine. So we shouldn't be on a part of this country. If you compare the same message with AfD, for example, or Marine Le Pen, it's the same. Maybe Ukraine, it's not so valid, it's not so active in this message, but the rest is the same.
It must be said now that you actually know Rafal Trzaskowski quite closely. He was your boss when you served as deputy mayor of Warsaw. What analysis do you make of the final results, in the sense that in the end he was not able perhaps to speak to the broader population of Poland? Do you feel that his message was too targeted to the elites and to the people living in bigger cities, and ultimately was not able to break this divide that is very common in Polish elections, this rural versus urban divide?
I have such feeling that he did everything. Like Rafał Trzaskowski as a candidate, he did everything to win this election. So it's very easy to understand for me that really this effort who he did, like nine months of the election campaign, because it was the pre-election campaign, then election campaign, pre-election, I mean, in civic platform election. It was very tough work. The only thing which happened or which was like the weak point of this election campaign was that Rafał Trzaskowski became a very easy target to attack because he is not representing only, let's say, this liberal part of the country, but he's also representing governing party in this country. And by this meaning, every fault or every promise that was not delivered between 2023, so the last governmental election, parliamentary election, and now, it was very easy to attack to him that that's his fault, that something wasn't delivered or something happened wrong by the governing of the country. It was totally not to manage, let's say, in the process, because you cannot manage the topics that belong to the government, especially when this government has very huge agenda of reform that should be done. And many of this reform was blocked by the current president. So that was like the trap, unfortunately, to him, that many of things that was by which Rafał Trzaskowski was accused, that he's not delivering, the government is not delivering the promises from the elections from 2023. That was totally weakest point of this campaign, and that was one point which was, let's say, an advantage of the candidate who was running up after him for many months. And at the final dates, he won by a very tight difference of the voters.
Since Donald Tusk assumed office as Prime Minister, the European Union unblocked some funds that had been blocked during the rule of the Law and Justice Party. However, the funds were unblocked and frozen, mostly based on promises made by Donald Tusk that you would reimpose the rule of law in the country. He hasn't been able to do so, as you already said, mostly because these measures have been stopped by President Duda. What I want to understand now, if with Nawrocki, will this mean a return to a more turbulent relationship with Brussels, like the ones we saw before Donald Tusk became Prime Minister?
Every element of the legislation process which belong to this process of the unblocking of the funds from recovery fund, where president can block it, is now endangered. So that's for sure, and that's true. Some of the elements of this process were postponed in the process of the legislation just because of expectation that the presidential office point of view gonna be changed after the election. So now we can only suppose that it's gonna be even stronger in opposition to the current government. And in this meaning, I'm not really sure that Nawrocki will have even a bit in the process of the legislation, which is, let's say, in line with European legislation. So it's gonna be roughly done in the opposite direction. So it's gonna be much more stronger opposition as current president. So upcoming few months gonna show us what's gonna happen with this, let's say, package of the reform that we should done not only because of the obligation from European Commission, but also many of legislation or many of reform belong to the, let's say, coalition program, which should be delivered before next elections in 2027.
Nawrocki promised he would block Ukraine's bid to join NATO. However, he agreed that he would continue to provide weapons to Ukraine. Given the limited role of the president in Poland, how much of a dent can he actually make on Poland's continued support to Ukraine and defense matters overall?
By this part of his policy, he's very close to the position of the Donald Trump, actually. So I suppose that he's gonna do everything that it's in line with the Trump administration policy. I'm not really sure if Trump gonna block, let's say, the process of solving the problem with the war of Ukraine. He is in this process, and he promised that he's gonna end the war in Ukraine. And I believe Nawrocki will change his mind only because of the interest that it's representing against the American administration. Even if we count that Trump position or Trump policy or statement against Russian and Ukraine war, it's far from our expectations because we expected that it should be stopped very close period of the time, or tight period of the time. Even if we think that it should be done faster, stronger against Russia as a position, I'm not really sure if Nawrocki can deliver his promise that he's gonna block the position of the Ukraine against Russia. He's gonna change his mind. I'm pretty sure. So of course it's only my supposition, but he is very committed to the Trump administration, and he proved it many times during the election campaign. So he will do everything that is in line with the Trump administration policy. And some element of this position is it's in line with the Polish government's position. So I'm a bit more optimistic in this point. I never believed in his promise that he's gonna block, for example, the move Ukraine into the, let's say, European process or NATO process, because he did it only because he wanted to take some votes from far-right parties. So it was like, I'm gonna promise everything that you want. So he did it as a move that some politics, especially from far-right parties, they did, but they never delivered this promise because it's very hard to deliver such promise only because it's not belong only on his position. This process of the, let's say, Europeization or Europeization of Ukrainian states, or finishing the war at Ukraine against Russia.
And the same day that the results were known, the Prime Minister called for a vote of confidence in Parliament. He's widely expected to survive this vote of confidence. However, the next elections are supposedly only in 2027, but can this be the beginning of a government crisis in Poland? Do you foresee that these results will lead to early elections?
This move with this vote of confidence, it's very often kind of the move that politicians made or the prime minister is doing just to show the power that he had. I'm pretty sure that it's tactical move just to show against opposition that he's still, let's say, keeping the power, and he will deliver the promises that he made. So I'm pretty sure that it's not the beginning of the government crisis. It's more, let's say, exposition of the power or defining the power that you have. But in Poland, such moves are very often in the process. Even in every case, then voters can have the feeling that government is losing his power. And usually, Prime Minister is applying for a vote of confidence just to make a debate, just to present his position, and just to underpin it, underline it, and to show that he's still keeping the power. So it's a tactical move from my perspective.
And that's it for today's show. I'm Katarina Villanova, and Policy Voices will be back again next week. Until then, goodbye.